from Halloween, right? That makes sense? Well, there's these two young men that had just had this Halloween party, and they'd had a couple drinks at said party, and they were kind of carrying on a bit and having a good time, and they thought, just for kicks, they'd cut home through a cemetery. And so here they are wandering through the cemetery, trying to scare each other, telling each other scary stories and this dark, misty cemetery. When suddenly, right in the middle of all this, they hear this tap, tap, tapping. And they hear it coming from somewhere in the distance in these dark, misty shadows. Well, they'd gotten themselves worked up at this point, so they got to be pretty afraid, and they were actually trembling with fear as they finally approached this place. And they found an old man with a hammer and a chisel, chipping away at one of the headstones. "Oh, thank goodness," one of them said after catching his breath. "You scared us half to death. We thought you were a ghost. What are you doing working here so late at night?" "Those fools," the old man grumbled. "They misspelled my name." The Easter Bunny jokes that are out there are just terrible. I have to say, they're even worse than that one. You'll understand why I chose that in a second. At Easter, we do, I asked the earlier service what they think about at Easter, what images come to mind, and many gave very good religious, theologically appropriate answers of resurrection and new life and hope. But I also think of Easter bunnies and chocolate, especially the Cadbury bunny, that it sounds like a chicken, and I think about these things because I've got a sweet tooth. But when we think about Easter, actually, we don't often go right to this image, but really it's to the image of the tomb. Really, it's to a graveyard of sorts. That Easter is very much about grief and death and cemeteries and fearfulness and something else. Now, we gathered here today are gathered around the empty tomb to ponder its significance. If we're honest, we're unsure about what it really means, or if we really believe it. Sure, if we can really believe in the resurrection. Now, there are times when we want to believe, maybe even desperately want to believe. Usually these are times of grief, times when we've lost someone. We are forced to ask ourselves questions of life and death and what we believe about it all in these times. But so often the sadness that grips our heart can make it so difficult to hope. Well, Mary Magdalene, who's really a central figure in today's story, she was in the midst of deep anguish and grief at the time of our gospel story. Now, John, the storyteller, sets the scene with the phrase, "while it was still dark." Now, he's used this literary device before. It was under the shroud of darkness that the doubting but searching Nicodemus was sought to talk with Jesus. It was also at night and under the cover of darkness that Judas betrayed Jesus just a few days before. And now Mary approaches while it is still dark. She comes to her Lord's tomb, gripped by deep anguish and fearfulness, her faith very much in flux. Now, perhaps she chose this early hour in order to have some time alone at the graveside, some time to talk with Jesus. Or maybe her grief was so overwhelming she was afraid to run into anyone else, that someone would see her losing it, losing the handle on her life and her grief. But for whatever reason, she came that early, but she found that tomb shocked her expectations. She found the tomb empty. She found that the stone had been removed. And her first instinct was then to go and fetch Peter and John and have them come back. And then they went right in the tomb and found the burial clothes. And then they returned to their homes. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. Mary cannot bear to leave the sight of her grief. Let's try to imagine Mary's pain a little bit. We don't know a lot about her life. Some traditions hold that she had a very sketchy sexual reputation. maybe even was a prostitute. We don't really know that for certain. St. Luke tells us that Jesus had healed her from demon possession, from 7 demons. Now we know that the New Testament sometimes talks about demon possession in a way to explain an illness of sorts, maybe even a mental disease. Sometimes it may refer specifically to a spiritually devastating condition. But in any event, Mary was oppressed. Mary was in deep pain and agony. But she found wholeness in the presence of Jesus. She was a woman living in a man's world with very little by way of rights or means of support. And when I think of Mary, I think of all the broken people in the world. I think of the working poor struggling to keep a roof over their heads. I think of the mentally ill and those living with addictions, bound by their compulsions. I think of the sexually promiscuous, desperate for human contact of any sort. Well, when Mary met Jesus, everything changed. He healed her and showed her dignity and welcomed her into a new family. She held company with Jesus' closest disciples and was privy to his teachings, miracles, and life-giving presence. How exciting that must have been. Have you ever stopped and thought about it? How exciting must that have been to be with Jesus in those days?